wanted to show you this video. So it's Prager University, and they're arguing that the atomic bomb was absolutely necessary. And I'm going to show you a few arguments of like why it's controversial. I'm not saying that it never should have happened, but I'm saying there's more controversy to it, and students need to understand all sides of the issue. Students in other countries, they learn about the controversial aspects of United States history much better than our citizens do. In a way, it's censorship trying to keep people patriotic. A lot of the ideas come through this book. So this is Untold History of the United States, with Peter Kuznick as the historian, and Oliver Stone involved because they made a documentary of it. It's on Netflix. But a lot of the ideas come from that. Let's go ahead and watch.
President Harry S. Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved to be one of the most controversial decisions in American history. As the years have passed, the controversy has only intensified. More and more people, both in America and abroad, have condemned both President Truman and America for that decision. But this criticism is based on limited historical knowledge of both the situation Truman confronted and the basis for his decision. Such flawed analysis has been aided by the unfortunate influence of some very bad history, such as that written by members of the so-called atomic diplomacy school. These historians disgracefully alleged that Truman proceeded to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which he knew was on the verge of surrender, so as to intimidate the Soviet Union in the already developing Cold War. That specious interpretation must be refuted fully. Truman sought to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 major military-industrial targets, to avoid an invasion of Japan, which Truman knew would mean, in his words, quote, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other, end quote. His assumptions were entirely legitimate. By July of 1945, the Japanese had been subjected to months of devastating attacks by American B-29s. Their capital and other major cities had suffered extensive damage, and the home islands were subjected to a naval blockade that made food and fuel increasingly scarce. Japanese military and civilian losses had reached approximately 3 million, and there seemed no end in sight. Despite all this, however, Japan's leaders, and especially its military, clung fiercely to notions of getsu-go, decisive battle. In fact, the Japanese government had mobilized a large part of the population into a national militia which would be deployed to defend the home islands. Confirming the Japanese determination to fight on is the fact that even after the use of the atomic bombs against both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese military still wanted to pursue that desperate option. The atomic bombs forced Emperor Hirohito to understand clearly, and in a way his military leaders refused to comprehend, that the defense of the homeland was hopeless. It took the unprecedented intervention of a Japanese emperor to break the impasse in the Japanese government and finally order surrender. It was only the dropping of the atom bombs that allowed the emperor and the so-called peace faction in the Japanese government to negotiate an end to the war. All the viable alternate scenarios to secure American victory, all would have meant significantly greater American and Allied casualties and much higher Japanese civilian and military casualties. According to American military estimates at the time, those numbers would have been well above 1 million. Hard as it may be to accept, Japanese losses would have been far greater without the bombs, and the overall casualties would also have included thousands of Allied prisoners of war whom the Japanese planned to execute in case of invasion. Truman's use of the bomb should be seen as his choosing the least awful of the options available to him. Even in retrospect, far removed from the pressures that Truman faced in 1945, his critics can offer no serious and convincing proposal regarding a viable and less costly alternative. The judgment of history is clear and unambiguous. The atomic bombs shortened the war, averted the need for a land invasion, saved countless more lives on both sides of the blood-soaked conflict than they cost, and ended the Japanese brutalization of the conquered peoples of Asia. Given the alternatives, what would any moral person have done in Truman's position? I'm Father Wilson Muscamble, Professor of History at Notre Dame for Prager University.
One of the things I want to point out that's not mentioned anywhere in the Prager video is the fact you had General Groves. So here's a picture of him. This is Leslie Groves. There's a quote from him in which he'd been talking to some scientists that weren't in favor of dropping the bomb, and Groves tells them, says, "You realize, of course, that the main purpose of this project is to subdue the Russians." Okay, now there's similar ideas being pushed by Burns as well. And so this historian that Prager uses, for him to say that that's just like this that's an unsubstantiated theory that the bomb was dropped to intimidate the Russians, like there's evidence to the contrary, but he just doesn't mention it because it doesn't support that. Prager also doesn't mention anything about Henry Stimson, so he's the Secretary of War at that time. And so the CIA had Alan Dulles. He had reported to Secretary Stimson about what he had learned from Tokyo, Japan. He said they desired to surrender if they could retain the emperor, and the Constitution is a basis for maintaining discipline and order in Japan after the devastating news of surrender became known to the Japanese people. And so understand that there were officials in Japan's government who wanted to surrender. They just wanted to be able to retain the emperor. That was something that was important for them. Stimson tried to explain this to Truman, but Truman really didn't care. Henry Stimson tried repeatedly to convince Truman and Burns to just assure the Japanese that their emperor would remain in place. Stimson at one point complained to Truman. He said that he was ignored, and Truman told him that if he didn't like it, he could pack his bags and go home. Stimson was a frail old man at that time. The Potsdam Declaration, which was given to Japan, it didn't have any modification of surrender terms, it didn't have any warning about the bomb, and it didn't give any notice of the Soviet Union's entry into the war, and so they knew that Japan wasn't going to go along with it. Truman didn't invite Stalin to sign the Potsdam Declaration, which would have alerted Japan that the Soviet Union was joining against them. And so the Potsdam Declaration lacking Stalin's signature, this basically encourages Japan to keep fighting. And they were reaching out to the Soviet Union for help. And what they said about prisoners of war, understand that when the bomb went off, there were prisoners of war that were killed by the explosion. But even some that survived that are beaten to death by Japanese civilians who were so upset and probably injured from the bombs going off, where they had family members that were killed. So U.S. prisoners of war weren't safe in either scenario. Also note that the video doesn't mention General Douglas MacArthur, who said that the bomb was completely unnecessary. He held a press conference before the bomb was dropped and said that Japan was already beaten. So he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific. If anyone would know like how necessary the bomb was or not, it'd be this guy. But of course, Prager just leaves it out. They are always cherry-picking information. They can compile an argument, but it's because they're leaving information out. They're only looking at ideas that support their claims. When Truman received news that the bomb had gone off, he jumped up excited and exclaimed, this is the greatest thing in history. Okay, it's things like that that show how controversial this was. Truman wasn't an educated man, but still, it takes a special kind of person, or a really unique person, to view the deaths of some innocent individuals as a positive. So Oppenheimer wrote that they were under great pressure to get the bomb done before the Potsdam meeting. So understand the Potsdam meeting. This is where Truman's meeting with Stalin, and they're talking about negotiations. So it's indicating that the bomb was a huge tool in having leverage against Russia as the war was ending. Okay, so understand, I'm not saying it was 100% unnecessary, but there is a lot of controversy behind it. Anytime you have someone trying to take a really complex subject, trying to give you a 3-minute explanation, and then say that the case is closed, that should definitely raise your eyebrows. You should be wary of that. So let's go to the reasoning. Like, why would Prager University want to convince people that the bomb was necessary? Well, for one, it increases patriotism and nationalism. Makes people feel that their country is always in the right. Makes them less likely to connect the dots of things that were wrong with Vietnam and the Gulf War and the Iraq War. And really, it appeals to their conservative base. Conservative bases are more often to support a strong military. They're less likely to criticize a bloated $738 billion military budget when it's more than the next 10 countries combined, even though 6 of those 10 are allies. But cherry picking information, it's not something that really can hold up to scrutiny. They're cherry picking their information for a reason, and when you really see the entire picture, you'll realize, like, oh, no, the case is not closed. There's a lot of controversy with this. If the US would have told Japan that they could maintain their emperor, and also if the US would have told, if everyone would have told Japan about Russia being on the side of the US, then that would have made a difference. Again, there were Japanese soldiers who said one of the biggest blows was when Russia started invading Manchuria. They're holding in China. Thanks for watching. More coming out on history, politics, psychology, Prager University critic videos. Understand, if we are to progress as a society, we need an intellectual revolution. We need people to understand ideas, and not just like a small percentage of the people. We need a country where we have 50% or more of the people understanding like big ideas, understanding history, understanding complex political ideas. And it might not happen for a long time, but it can happen 20, 30, 50 years from now if we do it right. Thanks for watching.